Nicholas, you have this fantastic quote here when we're looking at Diablo 4, and I don't think I can read it as good as you.
I think we need to begin with the question that sort of heads the episode.
Okay, that's
which
right.
is,
So really quickly though, so for some context, I'm playing Diablo, or I'm watching my partner play Diablo 4. And you're probably going, well, why are you talking about Diablo 4? I start asking, right? Like, hey, like, what do you like about it? What are these things, right? And the more I think about the history of Diablo, the more I'm going, the question becomes, right? Is Diablo 4 an RPG? And
yes.
Nicholas goes, yes.
Yes, it is. Thank you all for
Thanks.
listening. No, but okay. So I guess we have to sort of explain the entire drama as it played out. So like Lauren messages me, and she says precisely that. It's like, is Diablo 4 really an RPG? And I have to admit that at the time I was extremely dismissive. I'm like, yes, Lauren, it is. What are you doing? But she.
No, and I went like, no, hear me out, because I'm sitting here with my game developer friends. Like, we're in the industry, right?
Yeah.
And when you're in the industry and you're a gamer, right? So you're as a player, like sometimes it's hard to kind of put your player glasses on and think this is how a player would see it.
Yeah.
But you also have to realize there's this third category, and that's the marketer, right? So you're like, how would you, right, pitch this game to an executive, or how would you pitch it to, right, Square
Yeah.
Enix marketing? And we're looking at there, we're sitting with our game dev friends, and my partner's playing this game, and he's like, no, it's not an RPG. Now, marketing wise, it's called an action RPG. But so here I am having a conversation about all of the ways Diablo is not a role playing game. And then so I just like casually asked Nicholas a couple weeks ago, is Diablo 4 an RPG? And I get an vehement yes. And I'm like, Nicholas, explain thyself.
I was pretty I was pretty miffed that you even asked.
You were.
But the thing is, okay, so like the simple response isn't just a marketing one, but it's also sort of like Diablo 4 exists within a tradition of games that are very much focused on character progression. And character progression is central to role-playing games. That is, in fact, the role that you play. Like, that's what it refers to. And so, like, having so much of gameplay centered on, like, how your avatar progresses in terms of, like, you know, maybe gear or stats or abilities, or, like, whatever progression systems you develop. But all of those progression systems are centered on the player and on the character. So, to me, in that sense, it's like, well, yeah, then obviously Diablo is an RPG. But then, because I'm like, wait, okay, so Lauren is not a dumb person. She would not bring this up just to be like, just to annoy me.
Just to be contrarian. Yeah. You know, I'm not a dumb person.
That's my role. I'm the dumb contrarian. That is your role.
You are the dumb contrarian.
So I started thinking about it, and I started actually doing some research and looking into it. And I uncovered this quote that Lauren just alluded to. I'll read it, I guess. It's from David Brevik, for those of you who aren't familiar, is the creator of the original Diablo game and was also the director and sort of lead programmer on Diablo 2. So Diablo...
And also, just so that we're all, sorry, not to interrupt you, but just so that we're all clear, though, right, is I believe David Brevik is no longer at the company, right? He is no
as
longer
of
working.
Had no involvement in Diablo 3 and no involvement in Diablo 4 either. So that's actually worth noting, because we actually are going to make we're going to put a pretty bright line between Diablo 1 and Diablo 2 and sort of like this other category of Diablo 3 and Diablo 4. But when Diablo was being incepted, and he was interviewed about sort of like his inspirations and like why he decided to create the game that he did, he said this, quote, "One of the things that we were trying to get with Diablo was ease of gaming. The NHL series," and he's referring to sort of the NHL video game series, "was really good at this, where you just click and you're in the game. Before Diablo, when you created a character, you had to answer 53 questions about this, that, and the other. You had to name it, give it a backstory, and so on. We just wanted to get in and start smashing things." Now, it's interesting that the things that he specifically singles out as annoyances to be avoided are things traditionally associated with RPGs. Like, I mean, if you think even about going all the way back to pen and paper, what is one of the very first things you do? You sit down with a character sheet, you come up with a name, a race, a class, a backstory, their feats, their stats. Those are the 53 questions.
Right. And what's interesting, though, to me is that if we look at character creation in role-playing games, I would say that it's incredibly different than, say, character creation in Bloodborne, for example. Yeah. I don't know if I would consider Bloodborne an RPG, though it has RPG elements. because while it has a highly visual, right, character creator, you can pretty much do anything you want with it, which is why I think the monster character creators on YouTube like create these really like ugly or terrifying, right, sliders, is
Yeah.
because like the visual fidelity in scare quotes here, but the visual right range of your characters can be so large. But
Yeah.
then think about a game that is very traditionally ingrained in these character creation processes, which is Dragon Age. And in Dragon Age, you have less visual sliders, but you have to choose a very specific right race, right? So Dalish, elf,
Yeah.
human, etc. And depending on the cross collaboration, are you a Dalish mage? Are you a human mage? Actually has really interesting notes of intersectionality of identity that then is reflected to you by characters. So what class you choose is actually right a determinant of how society reacts to you, what
Exactly. Yeah.
race you choose. I think that's really important because in Bloodborne it doesn't really matter what your character looks like or who your identity is, because society will treat you the same regardless. But in
Yeah.
right say in a more traditional kind of Dungeons and Dragons style, it
Yeah.
does matter because now NPCs will treat you differently. And I think that for me is also why I immediately went to Diablo 4 is no, not an RPG. So I wanted to probably to identify that because that's not character progression, though we will be
Yeah.
talking about
Well,
that.
no, and that's actually a really good point, because one of the reasons why it's not is that if you look at From Software games across the board, so not just like Bloodborne and the Souls games, but also if you look at the Armored Core games, like Armored Core and Dark Souls actually have similar like design structures to them, in
Oh,
that
I
like
love it when you do this
when you
because
create
yes.
a character in Bloodborne, you are essentially doing the same thing that you do when you build a mech in Armored Core. And so then both of those games are very encounter centric. And the more encounter centric a game is, at least traditionally, it tends to be that the less character centric they are. And I think that's one of the reasons why character creation or mech creation in those games, like mech creation, strangely matters more in Armored Core than character creation matters in like Souls games.
Right. And it's because like the mech is actually somewhat of your identity. And I think that's what's like a really great
Well,
focal
and because it
point.
affects encounters, it actually
Yeah,
affects
it
things in the
affects
game.
encounters. No, and like the same is true, right, for Diablo 4. So I think what's
Yeah,
really interesting here is that this quote by Brevik, right, was inspired by those sports games, right?
yeah,
NHL, which for those of you who are listening, maybe abroad or internationally, NHL stands for the National Hockey League.
yep.
Just FYI, because I realized that we didn't actually do
Oh
the
yeah, it's a
acronym,
hockey
and
game. It's a hockey
it's a
game.
hockey game. And so outside of the United States and maybe Canada, right? Like you're not going to. It's something you don't know what hockey is. It's just NHL is. It's not
Yeah,
like NFL or. Do you know what I mean?
hockey is a very North American thing. So yeah,
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
And so I kind of wanted to talk more about those types of references they had because, like, interestingly, this character, this notion of identity, right, of who you think you are, right, is
yeah.
what actually made us split with, like, what the hell is an RPG anyway?
Yeah. And so like that is sort of like what pushed it was certainly is what I mean, Lauren was already kind of moving in the no direction, but that was definitely what started to push me into the no direction, because I was like, wait a minute, like the way in which like the character interacts with gameplay in the particular world of Diablo is very different from the way, to use Lauren's example again, like the character you create in Dragon Age interacts with that world. Like when you make those choices about your character in Dragon Age, like they have very serious ramifications for how the game will play. Whereas, but the thing is, like, you can say something now to sort of to bring it a little bit back towards the yes column, to make a better yes argument, if you will, is that then if it's about character progression, it doesn't necessarily have to be about character progression in the classic way in which we tend to think of RPGs. Like, in many ways, what you get in Diablo games, and especially in Diablo 4, is you get a kind, I mean, because you still have a lot of those like classic RPG elements. You still have sort of like inventory management, gear improvement, ability improvement. You have, a skill tree, like all that stuff is very classic RPG. But the thing is, at the same time, it's sort of all that stuff is directed towards combat encounters and improving your character's relationship to combat counters, rather than maybe to a story or to sort of like a social structure that the world of the game is trying to create.
Right. And here, Nicholas, is where we talk about Well, so if we don't know, like, let's say that it is an RPG, it's
Yeah.
yes, Diablo 4 is an action role playing game,
Yeah.
right? Because you are playing a role, which is the barbarian, the druid, the
Yeah. You're,
sorcerer, the
yeah.
necromancer. It's the role that you play. And I
Yeah.
mean, what's interesting here is that when we were looking at other action RPGs, the other game that my partner is not only obsessed with, but is almost a compulsion, as in before work, like I always see him playing this game. And no, it's not Tears of the Kingdom, which just came out. It's Path of Exile,
Yeah.
another ARPG, which to me is hilarious because I would never see Path of Exile as a role playing game. But if we're going to say Path of Exile and Diablo for our role playing games, you have, right, the character's stats, the character's progression through these skill trees. You have the ability to create different builds. Who you play as a barbarian this time might
Yeah.
be different as the barbarian next time,
Yeah.
right? And through that focused lens, while there's no emotional or social ramifications of your actions, this is actually a very valid, safe entry point, right? Where like
Yeah.
the characters of the world aren't going to say like, you Dalish mage, you're the most dangerous thing to society. They'll just be like, you make spells and help our community, thanks so much, you random in civilian thing, right? Like that sounded really terrible. And I'm not trying to, unfortunately, I love both character progression and like in terms of emotional narrative storytelling. I am in narrative
Yeah.
design as well as skill progression. Like I was a skills designer.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, my examples always will come off as inherently biased. So for a non-biased person
Yeah.
about anything at all, we should talk about RPGs that go all the way back to tabletop.
Yeah, because like, because this is the argument that I made to you when we were discussing these things, is that like, okay, so if you go back and look at the inception of like tabletop role playing games, roughly in like sort of like the late, well, I mean, when role playing games began is itself a thorny question. But if you go back to sort of like that transition, like when chainmail first appeared, chainmail, which was the precursor to D&D, like this idea that sort of you take these like tabletop war games and then we're going to convert that into something that has like a more narrative. And the thing is, like, it's worth noting that in sort of that original inception, like narrative was a central concern, but the way in which that sort of manifested in terms of gameplay was character centric, because it was because when first of all, it should be noted that like role playing games play very differently for the GM than they do for player characters. So I'm going to talk about this primarily from the perspective of player characters. So like, if you're a new player and you're joining a group, one of the very first things you have to do is either be handed a pre-generated or create a character of your own. And sort of like, but it's not just about sort of like creating the character. It's also about how you inhabit that character, how you create a personality for them, like how you come up with their visual aesthetics, how you describe them, how they behave in particular situations. Because, in role playing games, not every encounter is a combat encounter. Sometimes it's more like dialogue focused, or you have to try and convince someone to do something, or you have to sneak around. Like, there are other things that you can do.
Right.